Hey there, I'm Keith, and in this video we're talking about budget, fast, wide-angle lenses for full-frame Sony cameras. We'll be comparing the Viltrox 24mm 1.8 coming in at about $429 versus the Sony 20mm 1.8, which is priced at about $898. These lenses aren't exactly the same focal length, so it might sound strange to compare these two, but if you're looking for an affordable, wide-angle, full-frame lens with manual aperture adjustment, these actually share a lot of similar features. The prices aren't exactly the same, but when you start looking at the G Master line of lenses, you'll realize that there's a steep price curve for that badge, and at certain points, there's diminishing returns for features and quality. It's the reason that I went with the Sony 20mm instead of the 24mm G Master in the first place. Quickly jumping into the specs of the Viltrox 24mm 1.8, this lens costs about $429. It has a 9-bladed design and it can adjust from f1.8 to f16. Has a USB Type-C port behind the rear cap of the lens for firmware updates. The minimum focusing distance is a little far away at 11.8 inches. This isn't a huge deal if you're shooting landscapes or portraits, but it could be a problem if you're trying to take photos up close and get the most background blur possible. This lens is very light for a full frame lens, coming in at about 12 ounces. It's really small at 2.8 by 3.3 inches. The filter size is pretty small as well, coming in at just 55 millimeters. This is a third-party lens, but it's an autofocus lens, and it will pass all of the EXIF data to Lightroom if you're shooting photos. You'll have to apply some lens corrections in Lightroom to fix any distortions within your photos. Quickly going over the Sony 20mm, the 20mm costs about $898, which is $468 more than the Viltrox. The Sony also has a 9-bladed aperture design, but can adjust from f1.8 to f22. The minimum focusing distance is very close at 7.09 inches from the sensor. Shooting this close will create some distortion, and I wouldn't recommend shooting portraits like this, but it can be really handy if you're shooting product photos or just macro photography. This is not a macro lens, but you can get very close to your subjects. The 20mm is also 2.8 by 3.3 inches, and it weighs 1 ounce more than the Viltrox, coming in at 13 ounces. The filter thread is a more common 76 millimeters, and it is also not weather sealed. The Sony also has an aperture ring that can be clicked or declicked. The Viltrox lens is always declicked. The Sony has a manual and autofocus toggle and a custom button that you can configure in your camera. Personally, I never use the custom configurable button, but some people like to use it for switching focus modes or changing settings quickly on your camera. One of the biggest differences between these lenses is the build quality and materials used. The Sony feels like the typical hard plastic lens with the aperture ring and the soft rubber focus ring that we're all used to from Sony. Overall, the build quality is good and it's exactly what you would expect from a Sony lens, minus the lack of weather sealing. The Viltrox definitely feels a little cheaper. It's made out of a hard plastic and metal housing, but it feels very solid overall. The lens housing is that hard plastic and metal, but the hood is made out of that cheap plastic. Digging deeper into the aperture rings, on the outside of the Viltrox, you'll find a declicked aperture ring, where you can smoothly change your aperture instead of adjusting in full stops like you would with your camera's aperture adjustments. This is great for video. Being able to change your exposure smoothly while transitioning from a light to a dark scene is a nice feature. The Viltrox aperture ring has some resistance, but it's not as smooth as the 20mm ring. There is also some faint noise on the Viltrox while you're adjusting it. It's not like an electronic noise, it's more of the actual ring moving on the outside of the lens. It would have to be very quiet for you to film and hear this on your microphones, but it's something to be aware of. The Viltrox's ring can be adjusted smoothly, but it will take some finesse with that increased resistance over the 20mm Sony's easy to adjust aperture ring. On the Viltrox, the grips actually stop where the aperture indicators are, while on the Sony's, the grip goes all the way around and the aperture indicators are below that grip. Very good news about both these lenses though. Whenever you are in an A mode on the aperture ring, there's no way you're accidentally going to bump the lens and put it into a manual ring mode here. I know on the 24mm G Master, it's very easy to slightly bump this, but I've been using both of these lenses for a while. I've been using the 20mm since it first came out, and I've never accidentally moved from the A setting, or where you control it on your camera, to f22 and have my image just be completely dark out of nowhere. So that's good to note. On both of these lenses, I've never accidentally bumped the aperture rings. The Sony is easier to adjust than the Viltrox, but that being said, the Viltrox is still usable. If you're going to be adjusting the aperture while you're on a gimbal though, I would probably go with the Sony since it has the grip all the way around, and it's easier to adjust when you're in that manual setting, not the A setting. Manually adjusting the aperture on a lens when it's on a gimbal is something I would never personally do, but I thought it would be worth mentioning here. When it comes to autofocus, the Viltrox 24mm has very accurate autofocus in good lighting conditions, even wide open during the day. However, wide open at 1.8 in low light situations, the STM motor starts to track a little slowly. It can still pull focus without racking back and forth, but if the object is moving quickly closer and farther away from the camera in low light situations, it might struggle to keep locked on. The focus motor is quiet but not silent. You can hear the motor focusing in a silent room. When you're focusing, I was using the tracking focus and center focus on the A7S III with a transition speed of 4 and then 7, and the subject shift sensitivity to 3 and then 5, and noticed it being consistently slower than the 20mm on the A7S III. These lenses have two different focusing motors though. That I'll go over more in a second, but it could be a difficult task for any lens wide open to focus quickly in low light. The Viltrox is still able to pull focus, but there might be some slight lag when you stop the lens down. The problem becomes less and less at f2.8. The autofocus is faster, and at f4, the autofocus is really quick. The manual focus ring is smooth with a good amount of resistance. I use manual focus just for the sake of testing for this video, and it works, but the throw is a little longer than I'm used to with my 20mm. The focus ring on the 20mm almost has too little resistance, but more resistance on the Viltrox means you have to keep your camera steadier while you're adjusting the focus. One isn't right or wrong, it just comes down to your personal preference there. The Sony 20mm autofocus is superb though. It's one of the reasons I bought this lens when it first came out, and I've been able to rely on the autofocus to consistently nail shots. The focus motor is the dual XD linear motor system that is really quiet, fast, and locks onto subjects really well. If you've ever picked up a 20mm lens, this is the thing you hear moving back and forth if you move the lens while it's powered off. My microphone is up here, so let's see if you can hear it. It's very weird when you first pick this lens up. You're not expecting to feel something moving inside of it. This isn't broken. Whenever the camera is put on the lens and you turn it on, it charges that focus motor and this sound goes away. All that to say, the focus on the 20mm is really great even in low light. For autofocus, the 20mm is better, but it's double the price and it's a more sophisticated motor system than the Viltrox has. The 24mm didn't perform poorly, and I was very impressed for the autofocus in such a budget lens. When I was filming a motorcycle on my gimbal with the 24mm, I tried this lens out for a while and I was able to get consistent results without hunting. That being said, it was pretty good lighting conditions when I was using it. For the sake of a winner and loser, the Sony's autofocus is better, but that doesn't mean the Viltrox's is bad. I've been able to rely on it for shots, but for the absolute best results, use it at f2 or f4 for faster moving objects. When I was filming that motorcycle, I was at f4 and I was getting great results. On to image stabilization, both the Viltrox 24mm and the Sony lack any kind of lens stabilization. That was an easy section. I was really surprised when it came to focus breathing. You know, when you're trying to focus and your lens looks like it's zooming in or out, the Viltrox 24mm has very little focus breathing. Everything stayed in place in the frame when I had the lens wide open, focusing at the minimum focusing distance and then about 10 feet away. I'm very happy about this and didn't expect such great performance out of a budget lens. I love my 24-105 for not having any focusing breathing, but the Sony 20mm has terrible focus breathing. When I was doing the tests with these two lenses, the results were very different. This is a prime lens, and notice how the lens focuses close and zooms in, but focusing farther away, the lens zooms out. This is a 20mm prime lens, so it's not actually zooming. That's focus breathing, and it's pretty bad on the 20mm. I knew that before I bought it, and I just have to remember that I can't rely on this lens to keep a consistent frame if the subject is moving closer and farther away and the camera is stationary. I can do that with the 24mm, however. I typically use the 20mm on a gimbal or locked off where the subject isn't changing distance rapidly. This hides the focus breathing. No focus breathing is obviously better here, but if you know the strengths and weaknesses of your camera gear, you can make more informed decisions when you're going to film something. No focus breathing is also great for photographers as well, because you'll be able to focus stack multiple images without the frame changing. The 24mm definitely wins this category over the 20mm. As far as image quality is concerned, between both of these lenses, I would say that the Viltrox and Sony have soft images when shooting wide open at f1.8. Both got better at 2.8, f4, and f5, they were almost gone. The Sony had much less vignetting overall, and as a result, the edges of the frame looked sharper, since there was no harsh vignette, and I suspect that the glass is of higher quality on the Sony. The center sharpness of both lenses, even wide open, is pretty good though. The Viltrox has a slightly warmer color cast than the Sony. This is easily fixable in post, but it is something to be aware of. The Sony 20mm and the 24-105 don't have a big shift in colors, so if you're mixing these two lenses together, it will be easier in post-production than it will be to have a Sony lens and this Viltrox lens. It's not impossible, but something to be aware of. Knowing the strengths and weaknesses of each of these lenses will help you pick which lens is better for you and fits into your workflow better. Both have good image quality. The Sony's is slightly better than the Viltrox's when you're talking about wide open. The Viltrox has a heavier vignette, but the Sony is also double the price of the Viltrox. The Sony isn't perfect either though. It has that really bad focusing breathing problem, and if you know you're going to be filming objects that run closer and farther away from you, the Viltrox might be the better one to pick up here. So knowing what you're going to be filming will help you decide which of these two lenses is better for you. For the aperture ring on both lenses, admittedly, I have only used the aperture ring a few times in my life. Most of the time I keep them blocked and just adjust the aperture on my camera. And most of the time I keep my aperture locked off anyways and use variable NDs on the front. It's a nice feature to have, and in my experience with the aperture ring, the Sony's is better. It's smoother, the grip goes all the way around the lens, and it's silent. But you'll never notice the difference if you always keep the lens in A mode like I do and just adjust it on your camera. The thread size is also something to be aware of. On the Viltrox, you have 55mm threads, whereas the 20mm Sony's threads are the more common 67mm. I have multiple 67mm prime lenses, so I purchased 67mm VNDs, so I can just use them natively on this without the use of rings. For the Viltrox, if I want to use my VNDs on this lens, I have to use step-down rings to get that 67 down to a 55. Finally, and possibly the most important part of these two lenses is the price. The Viltrox is $429, while the Sony is $898. The Sony is slightly wider. It's built with higher quality materials, has more features, less vignette wide open, no color cast when comparing with other Sony glass, but it has pretty bad focus breathing issues. Is it worth $469 over the Viltrox? I can't really decide that for you. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and comment for the YouTube algorithm. If you're a returning subscriber, welcome back. And if you're a new subscriber, welcome to the channel. Thank you guys for sticking around and watching till the end, and I'll see you in the next one. And I'll leave you with a little clicked aperture ASMR. Nice.